Hello, everyone. I'm Noah Taubleib, also known as That Sound Design Guy, and I'm here with Chris Hegstrom, the audio manager at Insomniac Games. Chris, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Noah. I haven't seen you since DigiPen.
I know it's been quite a long time. It's been quite some time, and I'd like to think I've been up to quite a bit since then.
Fantastic. Good to be
So,
here.
so to start us off, could you describe exactly what an audio manager is? Like, what specifically does that entail? Is that more about handling other people's content creation and then like overseeing it like a director, or do you kind of get help them out with the nitty gritty of it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Noah. I guess an audio manager within games, especially, it's more of a people management position where I'm overseeing sound designers and sort of trying to make sure that they are empowered to grow their career, try to remove barriers, and basically, I spend a lot of my day communicating with other managers to determine sort of what other departments are up to so that I can kind of pass that information along to the other sound designers.
Cool. So kind of like a producer, sort of.
Kind of sort of it's somewhere in between, like it's a producer that's in charge of the careers of, or at least overseeing the careers of all of the audio managers that I work with have extensive experience in either sound design or audio direction in the industry as well too. So we know how to talk the talk and walk the walk.
Interesting. So now I'd like to ask a bit about you. So you have quite a long and varied history as a sound designer. I know
I
you've
do.
gone
There's a
from
long history in my gray beard. Yeah, sorry.
fair enough. It's very stylish. Uh, I know you've gone from an audio engineer at Blue Man Group back in the 90s. You were a senior sound designer and at Sony Computer Entertainment. I know you were a UX sound designer at Amazon, and
That's
now
right.
you're the audio manager at Insomniac. So I guess I'm just curious, what was that journey like going from A to B, and what sort of skills did you have to learn on the way?
E to B to C to Z. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it was a definitely a winding career path. And let's see. So to start out with, I went to Berklee College of Music for music synthesis, which is in their technology department, um, and kind of stumbled into a live sound gig at Blue Man Group when they were loading into the Boston Theater. Um, and I was there for about 3 years and learned the shows in New York and Chicago, as well as Boston, which made the holiday times when there's multiple shows a day. Sometimes I was actually even flying from city to city. Very
Wow.
exciting jet set, but also very stressful. Um, and then from there, did some kind of .com sound design stuff for companies that no longer exist, and eventually landed in the Bay Area to work at a developer known as Stormfront Studios back in 2001, I believe it was. And we were working on an Xbox launch title called Bloodwake, kind of high stakes boat action game. Um,
Cool.
it was a lot of fun. It was really cool to kind of be in the just to get thrusted into the world of console gaming.
Yeah, I hope you still have
Um,
a copy of that game
I
preserved.
do, I do. I have a copy still down in the basement. Um, and then from there, worked again for about 3 years at Stormfront Studios on Lord of the Rings Two Towers, and then a Dungeons and Dragons game called Demon Stone Forgotten Realms. And then I went over to LucasArts right across the highway there in San Rafael, and worked on Star Wars Episode 3, the video game. And that
Oh,
was really cool to be able to work with Skywalker while that was coming up. And it was a really neat time. After that, I went to Electronic Arts in Redwood Shores, again, still in the Bay Area, and worked on James Bond from Russia with Love. And then did a sort of an internal transfer at EA to Criterion Games in the UK and Guildford outside of London, where I worked on a first person shooter for PS2. It was called Black. And then after that, was the audio lead on Burnout Paradise.
Oh,
And
that was a
then
PS3 game, right?
that was PS3, exactly. Really good memory on that. It was developed on PS, one of the few games that was multi-platform but developed on PS3.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, and then ported to 360. Um, so after that, went to Santa Monica to work on the God of War team for God of War 3.
Oh,
Um, and then ended up getting recruited at Microsoft to be an audio director for the Connect launch titles, the Connect Adventures. Um, Moved up to Seattle. When was that? It was the end of 2009, and worked at Microsoft for about 5 years. Worked on the Connect. Then the Connect team got kind of transitioned over to HoloLens, and then ended up being an experiential sound designer on HoloLens, and then that turned into um, being a UX sound designer. I worked specifically with the operating system team and the UX on the shell and sort of interactions. And that was my first introduction into kind of UX, which was a lot of fun. And it was really cool. And then after HoloLens shipped, I left Microsoft and started my own company called Symmetry Audio. And then I worked for Unity on their own sort of kind of VR thing. And then I worked for HBO Code Labs on, again, this was sort of the VR gold rush back in like 2016 or so. Um,
I feel like ever since Half-Life Alyx, we were kind of like in that gold rush. I feel
yeah,
like
yeah,
people are experimenting
exactly.
a lot.
Yeah. HBO Code Labs had Westworld VR and then Game of Thrones VR, which were all kind of promotional things that weren't like released outwardly, but made to kind of showcase the show and the technology as well too. And then worked with Google for a while on some more UX stuff. And then from there, I got called by Amazon to come in and work in their devices and services group as a senior UX sound designer, which again was sounds for um, the Alexa Echo devices and Fire TV, and then whatever devices and services kind of come through within the organization, which was big because there's a lot of different divisions in a place like Amazon. Um, Ended up in around 2021, or actually in 2020, I transitioned over to a division of Amazon called Amazon Glow, and it was hardware software development. It was a pretty cool project, but it didn't wasn't super commercially successful. So
Well,
uh,
after all of that, only
yeah.
that's the only unsuccessful thing you worked on? Only that one?
I mean, depends on what you mean by unsuccessful. If you ask Metacritic, there might have been a couple games in there that were a little, but
What does Metacritic know?
yeah, exactly. So yeah, but as far as hardware goes and stuff like that, that was something that I say I was unsuccessful because the team got kind of uh, laid off at that point, or kind of that whole group got disbanded, and the team kind of went their separate ways. And through that, I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with the folks over at Insomniac, and got back into games after kind of a 10-year hiatus into UX audio. And I've been there for over a year now.
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there, some of
Yeah,
which, but I'd like to start with so UX, which I understand is user experience.
that's correct. Yes.
So can you break down how does user experience sound design differ from just default sound design? Like what are you thinking of while you're doing user
Yeah,
experience?
that's a really good question, Noah. User experience audio, I would say, is kind of a a shortcut into the interactivity of something that may not be super obvious, I guess. It's sort of I don't want to say a cheat code in video games for too long. No. But it's Yeah, it's a little bit of it's an achievement unlock essentially. It's there to help folks kind of um, get to where they need to within a utilitarian manner. So think of a doorbell that's considered UX audio.
Oh,
You know,
okay. So
um,
like signifiers in the environment that
signifiers
signal
within the
stuff to the
environment,
player.
right? Where there may not actually be any kind of visual affordance, or if there is, that user experience audio has to kind of exist in its own importance, I guess.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, it's pretty cool. Sonic branding would fall into that, in like logos, audio logos, and things
Oh,
like
yeah.
that.
Oh,
Um,
I mean, I understand that. Like my on the side of what on the side of working for the company I'm currently working for, I do independent sonic branding as like commission work. So that's something
that's
I've been
awesome.
very invested in the last few years.
Yeah, it's a really cool field, and it's really I feel like that field's growing a lot right now because there's a lot of advertising and a lot of companies trying to differentiate themselves from one another, and a really good way of doing that is through a Sonic brand, or a Sonic as they're called. Don't
I agree.
Not to be confused with the Sega series of
Yeah.
Sonic, yeah,
Or the late night breakfast restaurant.
or the former Seattle basketball team.
So I'm interested because you worked on such a wide variety of projects. I imagine there must have been a variety of limiting factors for like, for example, all the license stuff you worked on, like Star Wars Episode 3, the
Yep.
game. Because you're working on license work, and obviously you have to use sounds relevant that are, directly tied sonic brandingly
Yep.
to to the IP. So when you're working on stuff like Star Wars, were you given a specific library to work with? And like, did you have to get everything new you made approved by a guy to say, does this sound like Star Wars enough?
That's a really, really insightful question, Noah. And it is really, Lucas had their library that was specific to a lot of the Star Wars stuff, and that wasn't necessarily opened up until, somewhat recently with the Disney acquisition, and other um, developers working on that IP. But at the time, it was like all under the LucasArts, or the Lucas family umbrella. And yes, there was some very specific sounds created by Ben Burt and Matt Wood, and a lot of amazing sound designers from across decades, and across the prequels and the originals. So it was really, it was fascinating to have access to that. And as you said, there were a couple of examples where there was something in the game that wasn't in any of the canon, that hadn't been created. And I remember a sound designer kind of coming up to me and asking, where did you get the sound for that particular enemy? And I said, well, I designed it. And he's like, well, what part of the library did you get it from? And I said, well, I designed it.
Cool.
So yeah, and there were other times when some QA folks would come up to me and say, I remember one specific piece of feedback that I got was that I was using a Gungan shield for a destroyer droid shield, and that I should make sure to use the destroyer droid shield sound instead of the Gungan shield sound, even though the Gungan shield sound was so much better. Wow, where's
Right.
my jar of paste? I gotta eat it because I'm such a geek with that
I mean, in this case,
specificity.
I mean, in that case, it's like it's your job to very much know the difference. That's not being a
Yeah,
geek. That's just being employed.
right, exactly. That's, the canon, especially within the sonic identity of things like Star Wars, is very, very specific, and
Right.
you'd be mentioned on Wikipedia as somebody that messed it up if you put the wrong sound in somewhere.
Right. Right. And I guess I'm also just curious. So, like when you're making your sounds, how do you handle things? Well, first, like content creation, like obviously it's like you use some pre-established stuff like the Gungan sound, and then I assume some of your own original assets. I'm
Mhm.
curious, how often would you say you use library assets as like a base to work off of? And then I assume you do like a whole mix of editing and tricks. I know that's what I do.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Yeah, that's a great. I mean, so as you know, as I always love to use the chef analogy, right? You don't necessarily like a chef wouldn't necessarily just go buy something from, Safeway and then plate it, right? It's the same thing for library sounds I would use as reference, or if it's something that is kind of auxiliary to the experience. But anything that needs to stand out from a sound design perspective, I try to design a bespoke, audio cue or audio palette, sound palette for it. You want
right,
to what I would usually kind of set up a session, like a DAW session or something like that, and import all the elements, and then just play around with combinations of those to kind of see what would be, for a particular character. Maybe it's hit reacts, attacks, lunges,
of course.
strafes, stuff like that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
no, that's basically my process.
yeah.
And and uh and on the last subject I have for content itself, I'm
Mhm.
very curious. So obviously you work not only on a wide range of IPs, but on a wide range of technology
Yeah,
uh from the original Xbox to the PlayStation 3,
yeah.
then VR, and I'm sure a lot of things I've missed in that summary.
Yeah.
But um what is your experience with like technical implementation? Do you know any audio scripting, or are you typically working with teams who handle that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you have to at least speak the language. Um, Scripting stuff, there's a variety of kind of high level scripting I can do, low level scripting, maybe not so much. When you look at implementation within Unity, it's a lot of, um, coding, for lack of a better term. But for something like Unreal, you might have blueprints or, kind of user interface elements that make it a little bit friendlier for the non-coders to use. And that's sort of along my level of comfort. I don't, I leave the coding to the coders because I'll put a parentheses or a semicolon in some wrong place and it'll blow up the game.
Right,
Um, but yeah, as far as implementation knows, you have to kind of understand conceptually and understand the ideology and the reasoning behind it. Anyone, there's a whole argument about like, oh, is it a technical sound designer? Does it need to code? Or, and every sound designer is a technical sound designer nowadays, which is true, if you're using Wise or, Fmod or something like that, there's definitely an element of implementation that you have to understand. But it's all part of the process. Like you wouldn't make a song without mixing it, right? So it's
right,
kind of, like sound design is like the first 25% of audio in interactive media.
right,
The next 25% would be the implementation. The third 25% would be adjusting the design to fit the implementation. And then the fourth and final 25% would be polishing it to make it sound effortless or, smooth and, you know, intentional.
right. All right, so now I think those are all my questions about content. The next thing I'd like to ask you about is something a bit topical, and I should also clarify that before I ask this question, I am not asking this question relative to any company you have or are currently working for, but just in your own personal experience. Before I ask this, I just wanted that on the record. So, as you're probably aware, there have been a lot of layoffs in the overall gaming industry in the last few
Yeah.
months. It's made people very anxious in the future. And I'm just curious, in your experience as a sound designer during
Mhm.
these time periods, because you've been in the industry long enough to, I'm sure, experience a few of them firsthand,
Yeah.
where do you think sound designers typically rank on the totem pole of priority? Are they more likely to stick around during these periods, or are they the first to be kicked off?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question. So maybe two or three parts to that answer. First of all, yeah, you're absolutely right in, being within the industry or within the periphery of the industry for 20 years or so, you do see lots of cycles, lots of ebbs and flows, massive hiring, frenzies, and then, oh my God, we got to keep the shareholders happy, and um, that turns into, layoff season in certain cases. And yeah, I mean, the reality of it is that it's a very human thing, and it's, it's an unfortunate element of the industry. And right now we're seeing um, you know, a pretty serious pendulum swing on that side for sure. As far as where sound designers would kind of fall on that, I would say it's all contextual. For instance, is an entire project getting canceled, which was the case for me at Amazon, for instance. I'll just use that as an example because it's all public knowledge. Everybody understands it. Um, and in that case, there was an entire project that, you know, um, and that included, you know, a few sound designers and like two full-time sound designers and then a bunch of, 300 other people, right? Um, so in that case, it just is part of that project. Um, Otherwise, I do believe in most cases, most firms hire pretty conservatively when it comes to audio coverage, and audio sound designers tend to wear lots of hats within the level of input they have to a project. So in some cases, unfortunately, it can be a percentage game, like each team has to lose a percentage or something like
Right.
that. Um, and in other cases, the sound to audio team might fly under the radar a little bit because just their coverage is, there's no proverbial fat in most audio
Right. Because
teams,
it's
right?
like they're so selective that when they do
Yeah.
get in, it sounds like there's less there's less room to be cut because it sounds like these hiring sprees, they rarely overhire for sound designers, at least to a significant
Yeah.
degree compared to other departments.
Yeah, I mean, again, plenty of exceptions to the rule, but in the cases if you're gonna, be like a financial person looking at the bottom line on something and saying like, we need dialogue, we need music, we need sound effects, we need audio direction, and we've got four people that are working on an aspect of either of all of those things. So, you know, if you still need that to ship the project, you're not going to cut into the meat.
Right.
Um, Weird sound. But yeah, I mean, but then again, there's a lot of times there's less rhyme and reason for that and more of a uh, looking at a kind of top-down uh, financial distribution of stuff, in which case, I don't know. It's
Right.
a,
And that, I
I
mean, no
would,
one has perfect knowledge of these kind of things, but you've given me a very
yeah,
good amount of insight with your explanation.
yeah. And it's, again, it is very cyclical and it's, it's I have seen a number of these cycles, and again this one does seem pretty significant on this side. And again, I'll always come back to it. The biggest aspect of it is it's a human thing, and for every kind of line item that a finance person sees, is that could be somebody that um, brings home a salary for a family, or is affected on this more than just like a job or something like that. So that's the part that really is um it's
Sad.
tough, right? Yeah, bad, tough, right? Exactly. Because especially within industries like this where you have so many passionate people, the game industry is a great example of that. So many of these people would be doing it for free, and that's why they get hired to do it for money, because they love it so much, right? They want to do this. They want to do level design, they want to do lighting, they want to do sound design. So it I don't want to say that um there's a flip side to that passion, because people are so invested in what they do for that, it does become more than just the loss of a job for folks that are affected in that case.
Right. Though I guess just to add a little bit of hope, you had an amazing career. I know you mentioned around the start of this interview that you've worked on some projects that didn't quite super succeed, but you've
Yep.
always managed to land back on your feet. I'd like
I'm
to think that gives a little hope to my generation.
gonna knock on the wood over here because my career is still going.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Your generation has, I mean, and the other thing to remember about this is kind of for every like bloodletting of of larger companies or companies that may have hired very liberally during the boom times, what ends up happening is a lot of kind of smaller companies and startups really kind of flourish, and they start to blossom when those people kind of branch out on their own and start something really cool, and
Right.
then those
Like a
companies become, yeah.
right, like forest fires. They burn,
Um,
it burns to the ground, the fire, like somehow I know it like new it gets like carbon dioxide or whatever to the soil.
there
I'm
you
not
go.
sure of the
Yeah,
scientific
exactly.
analysis, but you know how people like do controlled fires to help other things
Mhm.
grow, something like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But there's definitely been some really cool companies that would not have existed had there not been some sort of layoff at like a larger company that,
Right.
um, so for that, there always seems to be some level of movement going on. Like, the end of one thing is the beginning of another, is how I like to look at it. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So I think that was the bulk of my questions. Thank you so much for your time. And are there any just closing thoughts you'd like to leave for the audience?
Oh, I'm curious to see what you're up to, Noah. What's going on with
Me?
you? Yeah.
Well, I'm working currently part-time. Funny you mentioned startups where people work for free, but I'm currently working part-time at a Digital Scorpion Interactive, an upcoming startup indie gaming company. We just published our first game, Tales of Valoris Swallows Defenders, for Android and iOS. I was the
Awesome.
audio lead for the project, actually.
Wow,
Uh,
congrats.
and we're working on something else. I don't want to say what it is yet, but
Nice.
looking forward to that. And then outside of that, because again, funny how you mentioned Sonic branding earlier. I also do Sonic branding myself. I do some commissions for individuals, for example. I don't know if you ever heard of Jay's Reviews. He's a YouTuber with around 200,000 subscribers. Kind of in the video essay category. I did a little Sonic for his new intro. That was fun.
Very cool.
I've
Wow.
done and I've done a few other things for some other company brands.
Awesome.
And then also, I'm just gotten into the world of content creation. If you go to that sound design guy on YouTube and or TikTok, you'll see not only some of the work I've done for other people, but I've also been doing a series of sound redesigns. For example,
Oh, very cool.
I just did a sound redesign series for all of the Xbox console startups.
Oh, fantastic. That's really cool. I hope you get some feedback from Brian on the
Uh,
original.
I know it was back when I took his class. That's actually how it started. We did one of those for a homework. I posted that on the internet just to get some engagement. It got a surprising amount, and I thought, oh, I can make content out of this.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic. That's really cool to hear. Yeah, and I hope that maybe a particular visiting artist over at DigiPen gave you some inspiration as well when you
Mhm.
saw or went to that particular
Yeah,
class.
he gave me some good feedback on one of my games. Anyway,
Awesome.
I think I'm gonna end the recording here.
Awesome.
Everybody, thank you for seeing us. Chris, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Noah.